Hi, HR Nation's Chris Rainey. Welcome to HR Leaders, the show where we interview today's most successful and innovative HR practitioners 5 days a week. Today, we have a very special guest on the show. We're joined by Jim Citrin. Jim is an expert on leadership, executive success, and CEO succession. He's also the author of 7 books, including the critically acclaimed book, The Career Playbook. Jim, welcome to the show. How are you?
Great, Chris. Great to be here with you.
I'm glad we made this happen. I feel like I was stalking you on LinkedIn for way too long before this, so I'm glad we're here now. Jim, tell our listeners a little bit about yourself personally and your journey to where we are today.
Great, Chris. Well, first of all, I am such a fan of what you're building and the platform and the way you're bringing innovative insights to a very wide audience with some amazing leaders. So congratulations on your success so far, and I'm really proud to be a part of your network. Just very briefly, I'm American. I've lived in Europe for a couple of years. I've got a little bit of a global perspective, but after undergraduate college here in the U.S. at Vassar College, a very good small liberal arts college where I studied economics and French, I went to Wall Street as an analyst and at Morgan Stanley. A pretty conventional start to a career, and I did well. And I was fortunate to get into Harvard Business School, where I graduated in 1986. And a little funny thing happened when I was in business school. Most everybody was terrified of interviews and how they were going about that job search process. But I found it so fun. I loved interviewing for jobs, because it just was engaging with people and kind of problem solving and selling, to be honest, figuring out what they wanted and then weaving your stories to be the answer to their problems. So I had all these different offers, and I ended up going to Goldman Sachs as a private wealth management trainee. And I had the idea there that it would be very prestigious, it would be good lifestyle, it would be very lucrative. And but when I got there, I really didn't like it. And what I had the insight is that you really have to focus on what you're doing day to day. And the focus there was on investing. And it turns out that I never really thought about that. I was just interested in joining Goldman. And so the best people in that were just brilliant investors, and they loved the markets, and I didn't love that. I got a call from McKinsey, the global management consulting firm that I'm sure your listeners are very familiar with.
Sure.
I'd interviewed with them at business school. They invited me to start the conversation a year later, and I ended up joining them and moved to the Paris office and had 5 great years at McKinsey, really learning how to serve clients, how to solve problems, how to write, how to communicate, and it was wonderful. And I did a lot of work in the media industry, and then I had the opportunity to become head of global strategic planning for a media company, which back in the early 90s was very prestigious and large and successful, the Reader's Digest Association. It was a $6 billion company, and I went there, and what I learned there was that actually the culture fit is kind of everything. And I hadn't paid any attention to that. And I ended up, after a year, not really being very successful there, calling someone at Spencer Stuart, who I had met the year before. And she told me, Jim, I had this idea a year ago that you'd really be great in our business. And I was like, the executive recruiting business? And she said, yeah. She said, all the good things about McKinsey without any of the bad. I was like, okay, well, that's a pretty good proposition.
That's a good pitch.
It's totally a great pitch. And so I met lots of people, and in January of 1994, came to Spencer Stuart in the US with a focus on the media industry. And it's been a great 25 years and 2 or 3 months ever since. So that's a little of the background. Sorry, a little too long, but
no, it's always important.
Mistake as well.
Yeah, it's always important, as you said beforehand. If I asked you when you were a young man where you'd be right now, you'd never have told me this story, right? So same with me. Yeah. I was a skateboarder, breakdancer / ice hockey player, and now I'm doing this. So yeah, I never expect it.
To that point, one of the books and thinkers that was very influential to me over the years is Marcus Buckingham. I don't know if you're familiar with his work.
Mm-hmm.
He wrote an amazing book called it's all about your strengths, strengths finder, and the concept is that people are much more successful when they understand their strengths and find themselves in roles that value those things that you're really gifted at. And it's hard to really know enough about yourself to know what your strengths really are, and it's really hard to then find a way to apply that. But if you have that consciousness and that focus and that kind of approach, you can test, to your point, Chris, you can test lots of things out, and you just find yourself in roles that where you're flowing and things are creating value. And that's where, I know you were a hockey player, kind of going to where the puck is, as the expression goes, as opposed to trying to always build up your weaknesses, which we all have.
One thing you just pointed out is once you know that and you're conscious of that is very powerful. Where we are now, during that career, where did the point come where you decided to write your first book? What was the inspiration around that? Just because I'm always interested to hear that.
So when I was at McKinsey, McKinsey had this very smart approach where they didn't do marketing in a traditional sense. They led with intellectual capital, and at McKinsey there was this approach where you had to create articles, and it was very internally competitive to see who could have the authority to try and publish something. And I wrote an article there too, but that idea of intellectual capital as marketing was imbued in me in my 5 years at McKinsey. So when I came to Spencer Stuart, our firm had a quarterly governance letter with a magazine called Directors and Boards. And this is 1995, Chris, so really early days. And I was brand new. I was 35 years old, and the senior partner sent a note around saying, anyone who has an idea to contribute an article for the quarterly governance letter, let me know. Now at McKinsey, if that had happened, there would be like 1,000 submissions and they'd cull it down and all this. And I assumed that was the case, but I wrote something back as a simple idea. I figured, okay, I'm young and I don't know much about boards and governance, but wouldn't it be interesting to take a look at if there's a case for young directors? And I just wrote that as a little idea.
And back then as well, think about how relevant it is right now. You were on the money there.
well, it was great because so I sent that back and they said, sure, that's a great topic. And so this is really funny. So I did this little study just based on American companies, and I did an analysis of the age demographics of the corporate directors, and there were only 5 or 6% at the time who were under the age of 50. So that was considered the young directors. And I literally called 2 of them and said, I'm doing this article for Directors and Boards on young directors. Can I come and interview you? And I went and I interviewed them. I had access to incredible people, and I was a nobody, but I interviewed them. And that process of getting their story and writing it up, that was the first piece. Number 2, then I wrote this article, and here's the funny part. One of my friends from business school was the associate editor of the New York Times business section. And I called her up,
good contact.
Allison Cowan. I said, hey, Allison, I've got this article that I'm publishing in Directors and Boards magazine. Would the New York Times have an interest in that? And she said, actually, we love that topic. And if you could do that quickly. And so Directors and Boards agreed, and we ran it in the New York Times on the Sunday New York Times business section, which had this massive audience.
Sure.
And then I got all these letters, and this is before email. I got calls and letters from CEOs around the United States who had read this, and they said, oh, I'm young, or I'd like to be on boards. And so I saw, like, wow, the power here. And then a friend of mine had written a book that was a bestseller, and I said, how do you write a book? And he said, here's the simple advice of writing a book. Write the book you want to read. If you want to really read a book and it hasn't been written, that will be the subject for you. This was 1997, and I was kind of walking around with that question in my brain. And I'm a big believer in just planting your brain with a question. And the brain and the world is a beautiful thing. You just let it sit there. About a month later, this thought just came into my brain. I was in Grand Central Station in New York, literally getting off a subway, and it just jumped into my brain. The book I would like to read is a book about the top business leaders in America. Again, it was just America at that time, and their personal stories. And wow, wouldn't that be cool to interview Bill Gates and Michael Dell and Howard Schultz and all these people? And that was the book I wanted to read. And long story short, like the way you've built your podcast and your audience and your business, again, I was nobody, but I went systematically and I did the research to identify by research who were the 50 best business leaders. And I contacted them all, and I went in person and I interviewed the most amazing people. And I wrote that up in a book called Lessons from the Top that came out in 1998, and it was a bestseller. And from there, it all followed. The first one's the hard one, and then it gets easier after that.
Yeah. Oh, I love that story. I'm so happy I asked that question. And because normally you ask people at that question, there's always an interesting story about where it came from and the inspiration, but that was incredible. And you did that in an era without social media, without LinkedIn, without all these amazing tools that we was talking about before the show. For me, I'm in a generation which makes it, I'm one connection, I'm one LinkedIn message away from some of these guys. Whereas you, how did that look? You was calling them up, sending them letters? What did that look like?
It was brutal. And you're absolutely right. There were a lot of disadvantages, Chris, to doing it in that era, but there was an advantage. The advantage is, at that time, there were no articles, there were no magazines, there were no websites that said the 100 best. I now, Harvard Business Review has the 100 best CEOs in the world. Fortune magazine has, their 50 most powerful women. That didn't exist. So when I did it by letters, I wrote a letter publishing a book, and I'd like to come interview you to be profiled as one of the 50 best business leaders in America. And I described the research, and usually we got shunted off to the corporate communications team. But here's the funny thing, and you'll get a kick out of this. The first question that the corporate communications people asked were, okay, is it really being published? Yes, I had sold a book to you. Number two, the question was, who else? And I knew instinctively
always who else, right? It's always who else,
right?
Yeah.
So one of my business school section mates at the time was the chief financial officer at Microsoft, Greg Maffei, who's now one of the most amazing CEOs. He's the CEO of Liberty Media. And I went to Greg first. I said, Greg, I need your help. I need to get an interview with Bill Gates for this book. And so he helped me there. And then through another colleague who had come to Spencer Stuart from GE, where she was chief communications officer, she got an audience with Jack Welch.
You got Jack Welch on. I need to read this book. I don't know
you should.
I don't know how I've read this book. I need to read that book.
Lessons from the Top. But in any case, so I literally had Bill Gates and Jack Welch, and so I was able to answer that question. And they were like, oh, well, if Bill Gates and Jack Welch are in, I'm in too.
So I had the biggest name drops ever. Like we call them name drops in our office. Like if you got those two, then that's it. It's set.
It was a great experience. And, like you, I'm really into the people stories. I'm a big learner. I think there's something to be learned from everybody.
I have to ask you a question now, because I'm sure everyone listening is like, well, what were the insights that you got from that first book, first and foremost? What were some of the common traits that you identified? And perhaps what were some of the areas that surprised you that you wasn't expecting?
Well, I'll answer that, Chris, but I'll also make it a bit of a dynamic answer, because I've been now at Spencer Stuart for 25 years. I've had the privilege of working on over 700 assignments, recruiting chief executive officers and C-suite executives. I've really seen what really works and what's most important in CEO leadership and top leadership, and what the derailers are. So when I started through that research, it was a good help, but it's become even sharper in my brain right now. And so I'll share that. But some of the stuff is absolutely timeless, and things, if you go back thousands of years to the Bible and Alexander the Great or whatever, there are timeless elements of leadership. And that has to do with being the strategic or thought leader for whatever the organization you are. You have to be the thought leader of setting a direction and having an understanding. We can talk more about that, because particularly as a CEO, that ability to be the organization's thought leader is absolutely essential. But the second thing is, it's a leadership aspect of leading by example. I believe that doing right by others and focusing on the success of others. And this was one of the differentiators in the 5 patterns. It's focusing on the success of those around you who work for you and who work with you, and investing in their success as much as your own success. That is a powerful differentiator. So there's a leadership by example and an attitude of abundance and caring that, and I think today in 2019, and as we get into the 2020s, there's no barrier between and no separation between your work life and your private life and your friend life. We're all one transparent being. And if you're a jerk or if you're inauthentic, you're going to get busted quickly. And so you really have to really care truly about others and be very transparent. But that leadership by example, I think, interestingly, what I've learned is that style is irrelevant. I've seen that the most charismatic people or the most introverted people, shy people, great public orators, and people who really can't speak publicly, that doesn't matter in CEO performance or even leadership. But linking that style to a set of values and a context, that's what it's all about. And here's something for you, Chris. I do believe that context, back to our earlier point about playing to your strengths, context is really critical, because I've seen the same person be massively successful in one context and a big failure in another context. Mm-hmm. And so understanding yourself and understanding your context and putting those two together is what it's all about. I can give you an example of that if you like. But those are a few things. It's the thought leadership, it's the people leadership, it's leading by example, it's caring about others. And people like being a part of winning teams. So that's why this thought leadership, coming up with strategies and directions that actually get momentum, people really flock to momentum and to winning.
I think a lot of people may be shocked at your point about charismatic introvert, and because traditionally everyone sees that if you're a CEO, you have to be the voice of the business, you have to do the public speaking, and in this day and age, it's just not true, is it? We see it now with a lot of the tech startups CEOs. They're not necessarily extroverts. A lot of them are introverts. However, they're highly successful.
Every CEO will need to be a good communicator, but to be a good communicator does not mean that you have to be an inspiring Churchillian orator. Yeah. You can actually be, it's more about being authentic and being substantive than it is about having a particular style.
One of the things I was thinking about when you're talking about your first book is just the process of you sitting down and putting together a set of questions. And what's the question that you love the most that you ask them that you think you got the most back from?
Well, I do what you do. This is how we often interview at Spencer Stuart when we're actually interviewing CEO candidates. But I love hearing the life story, because you see connections, and just kind of going a little organic with that is really important. Great question is asking someone, and whether it's in a life story or in an interview, you ask someone, Chris, give me an example or two examples of something in the last 18 months that you're most proud of. That's a great question, because it creates instantaneous self-editing. It also, when someone talks about the one or two things that they're most proud of, it gives you huge insight into the things that give them energy. I'll give you an example of how that has changed an organization. I was interviewing just having breakfast. It was kind of a courtesy interview with someone who I'd been set up with. This is summer of 2012, and it was in New York, and happened to be with a wonderful English, recently left CEO, a guy named Mark Thompson, who was the Director General of the BBC. We were in New York, and we were just chatting about his tenure at the BBC and his life a little bit. And I asked him that question. I said, so Mark, over the last couple of years at the BBC, what are you most proud of? I didn't know what to expect, but what he talked about was the process of envisioning and then leading, overseeing the creation and the launch of the BBC iPlayer.
That we was waiting for that forever. Everyone was like, where's the iPlayer? It was a big deal, because for so long, if you missed that show on TV, you couldn't see it again. And it was really innovative in its time.
It was hugely innovative. And what he did and how he and the team did it was all about digital transformation. of a pretty staid organization without a lot of resources. So with that insight, I then asked him the second question, which is like, would you ever consider coming to the US for a position, and New York in particular? And he said, well, my wife is American and my daughter is going to university here in the US in the fall. So for the right thing, I'd be open-minded. So with those two questions,
Wow.
I said, okay, I've got an idea for you. Would you consider coming and becoming the CEO of the New York Times company? He was like, well, that's really interesting. He said, I don't think they'd ever consider a Brit, and I don't think they'd consider they'd consider a video guy. But then when I went back to the chairman and to the search committee, I said, guys, I have an idea that is a little different. And I know we're looking for someone to lead digital transformation, and our spec is looking for more of a Silicon Valley product leader, but Mark Thompson of the New York Times. And the chairman said, Jim, you obviously haven't been listening to what we've been telling you as our criteria. We want a commercial leader, and Mark's a journalist, a brilliant journalist. And in the New York Times, there's a separation of the newsroom and the commercial side, and the newsroom reports to the publisher, and the publisher is the chairman, and the CEO just runs the commercial side. And they say he's not a product guy and he's a journalist and all that. And I said, I get that, but let me tell you the story of the creation of the iPlayer and how, and there's a theory of cultural transformation through having the credibility of being a journalist, but not being in the newsroom. He believes that you can actually leverage the journalists to create the digital transformation, not impose it from the business side. So with that whole process, he became the CEO, started in fall of 2012, and it's been a spectacular, one of the best digital transformations in the world. And it's all because of that question of what are you most proud of? It's a great example of, asking, the power of questions is really important. So
and listening.
Collecting up. Right.
Yeah. Well, what a story. What a story. So on the flip side of that, what were some of the common, when you was writing your other book, what were some of the biggest or most common mistakes that the CEOs were making and leaders were making?
I think from the research in the books, and also from what I've seen in reality, there are a few things, Chris. People who reach the top of careers, they're very competitive. They were very ambitious. They generally, I believe, the vast majority really come from the right place of really wanting to have a positive impact on others and create value, and that's great. But sometimes there's something that, particularly as the higher you go, the more people feel like it's up to them to be the savior or the hero. And if they think it's really all about them, and if they've got it, they'll work 24 hours a day, they'll drive their teams, they'll make perhaps promises because they want to deliver those results, but those promises can't be achieved. So one of the biggest causes of CEO failure is overpromising and under-delivering, and particularly in a context where you have very smart and active and sometimes activist investors who are really holding your feet to the fire. And if in a public company, if you're making commitments out there to say, we're going to deliver 8% growth, and if you miss a few quarters in a row because you're trying so hard to galvanize the organization to deliver the results, the gap between the reality and what you promise gets there, and that's a big cause of failure. So being very sensitive to ideally under-promising and over-delivering, that's a much better strategy. Another really critical ingredient of success, and it's something that boards can look at, and this is this idea of building a great team. And literally, when a board is looking at various candidates for a CEO, especially when it's looking at internal successors or external candidates, you literally look at the quality of the team they've built, where they've come from, how they've performed, what their 360 references say about them, and boards should and do focus on the quality of their followership as a real litmus test for their ability, because no one can do it alone, whether you're building your company as as an early stage company, or the new CEO of Unilever, who was just appointed in January, based on followership. So building a really great team as well.
Mm-hmm. I want to shift our conversation a little bit to what we were talking about before the show as well, because I was quite fascinated about your current, thought process and some of the ideas you're currently working on. Could you share more about that? Because I think it's quite fascinating.
So I'll be very personal here if I can. So I'm 59 and a half years old, but I feel 25 inside. I feel very fortunate. I'm very healthy and fit. I run 2 marathons a year. I've got the London Marathon 2.5 weeks, and I'm doing the same times 2019 as I did in the early 1980s. So I feel very energetic, very youthful, very passionate about what I do. The idea of at some point in the future being apathetic or not adding value or something is a bit terrifying. So I had this idea. There was this great exhibition about this architect named Renzo Piano. Renzo Piano is one of the world's most prolific architects. He designed the Pompidou Center, Beaubourg in Paris back in the 70s, and Kyoto Airport, and all sorts of things all around. And they did this interview with him that was on video here at the museum, and he's in his 80s. And he was talking about, and he looked so good and so fit and so energetic with a sparkle in his eye. And he talked about how he stays relevant and creative and active, and it's about building his team and all the environments. And I thought, wow, that's the kind of guy I want to be like when I'm in my 80s, still youthful and inspiring and impactful. So that was the first thought. And then a great business leader who I know named Domenico De Sole. He's the chairman and co-founder of Tom Ford. He's the chairman of Sotheby's. He's in his 70s. He's fit. He's amazing. And it made me think, wow, there's a series of people out in the world who are older, but who are youthful and relevant and active. And I want to learn from them, just like I did years ago in Lessons from the Top and others. And I did one book on the greatest sports leaders. I thought, wouldn't it be cool to identify and interview and develop lessons learned from people over the age of 70, let's say, across business, entertainment, sports, society, arts, leisure, and really learn from them for myself very personally over the next 10, 20 years, but also people who are in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, how to think about staying focused and healthy and vibrant over many, many years. So that's a topic that I'm pursuing right now. I had a meeting with a centenarian here in New York named Frances Hesselbein, who is over 100. She was the inspiring leader. She was the head of the Girl Scouts, and she's won all the honors. And I met her through someone who's been on your show, a mutual friend of ours named Marshall Goldsmith, who I'm very close with, who just turned 70. And he's a perfect example of someone who's younger at 70 than most people are at 40. And anyway, so there's lessons there that I'm going to pursue and apply to me personally. And I think it's not just me. I think as we all get older, how do we stay young and youthful and active and relevant is something I'm really passionate about.
Yeah. And because I love that you shared that with me, by the way, and thank you for sharing it with everyone listening, because I get upset when I feel like there's something in society that says when you get to a certain age, then you retire, and then, there's like this cultural thing that, that's just a normal thing to do, right? You kind of work your career, you get your pension, you retire, then you go and play golf. or in my dad's case, he's going to go off and do fishing around the world in different locations and do his thing, right? But there's so many other people out there, and I think those people too that have the energy. And Marshall's a great example, and all of the people that you mentioned are fantastic examples. And there's people that I know like that as well that get even more energized and more interested, and they're almost like they're hitting their peak even at 70, and they've got so much to offer the workplace and society that it's a real shame that seems to be the way things are supposed to be done, because that's how it works. You're going to work your career, you save your money, and then you retire. And I feel like it's a real shame that all of that knowledge and experience is also leaving the workplace. Just out of interest, going back to the work that you guys do in your organization, when you speak with CEOs that you're going to place in organizations, what are the main things they come to you with and say, this is what I'm looking for in an organization or my next role?
Well, I think it's two sides of the same coin. So when we're hired at Spencer Stuart, we get retained by organizations and boards to find their leaders.
Yeah.
And we always interview the board directors, and we do cultural surveys, and we link with their strategy departments to really figure out what's needed and where they're going. And then we develop our specs to try and identify the people who best meet that.
Just out of interest, obviously you're working with HR in that process, right?
HR officers and their teams are absolute partners in CEO and top executive recruitment and succession planning, because they're in it. And I'd say that, again, this is great credit to you and your organizations. I think that the role of HR has changed more than any other function in the last 20 years. HR used to be personnel, and it used to be back office, and it really was not considered of the same league with the CFO and the general managers of the business. But today, that's not true. Today, especially the best CEOs, they literally consider their CHRO their right hand. And it's wonderful for the HR profession, because now also with HR technology and data and analytics, it's not just about
feeling,
not administration.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not just gut. There's science to it. And I think it's one of the most exciting areas of business today. And I'm really, really happy to partner with great CHROs in these processes.
Have you, just out of interest, have you placed any CHROs in CEO roles?
That is a great question.
Because I'm seeing it more and more now. Over the last few years, I'm seeing more and more CHROs transition into that CEO role. There's not that many, if I'm being honest. But I'm just out of curiosity. I was wondering if you've seen any or placed any, because I'm seeing it more and more now.
There's only one that I'm familiar with off the top of my head, and I'm not going to mention the company because it hasn't been announced publicly yet. But one of the world's most admired companies, 100 billion plus. They view the role of CHRO as a massive CEO development role. So all of their last three CEOs, at one point within 5 or 7 years before they became CEOs, they became CHRO. So
wow.
That company specifically acknowledges it's all about people, and that to be the CHRO is a huge stepping stone to the CEO. And that's a big company that we've just finished a CEO succession for. Interestingly, it's often been the reverse, which is, can you get a CEO or someone who has been a giant business leader into the CHRO role?
Interesting.
And great companies like Microsoft and eBay and others have taken huge business leaders and put them in those jobs, and that's been very impactful. Starbucks, the CHRO, she was the general counsel and this massive, talented business leader and passionate about that in a great company where it's all about their partners. And then lastly, I'll just say that this is kind of the beginning, I'd say, of the golden era of CHROs on corporate boards. Years ago, there was very, very few cases where HR leader was asked to join a board. But now it's very common, as compensation has become such an important issue and such a controversial and complex issue, to chair compensation committees are now where a lot of CHROs have been recruited. And we're very big in that practice as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, knowing that what companies are looking for from a CEO, because obviously this is kind of part of what you guys do, what advice would you give to the CHROs that listen to the show, that are out there, that their future vision is to become a CEO?
Well, a couple of things. Number one, act as the leader that you are. Be very thoughtful about not just the people side of it, but how the people side drives the operations and then the financials, and be financially literate as well, and be able to talk about the financial and strategic implications of the people side as much as just the people as the end result. So speak like a CEO, where the ingredient is, your talent. Culture also is, I think, one of the most popular and powerful topics on the CEO and board's minds today, and how to transform culture. And CHROs who become the leaders in their organization for developing and transforming culture, I think that will be really, really powerful. And I'm sure many of your members and your audience know that and are doing that. HBR, Harvard Business Review, just had a cover story last year, incredible, on the Leader's Guide to Corporate Culture. And that's like a must read. And then having a really trusted relationship with the board as the CHRO, working with the compensation committee. So the compensation committee often will have a really important role in succession planning. So being very peer-like and doing great work and developing relationships with the board members through that process is important, just like CFOs do with the audit committee. This is, again, I think the early days, but this is a great time to be an HR executive and have a career in HR that can be much more frontline and actually broaden to other top business roles.
Fantastic. Well, Jim, I know I've taken a lot more of your time than I promised. Yep. So thank you so much for joining us. Show. Before we wrap up, we definitely need to do episode 2 at some point, because I feel like there's so much more to talk about. But before we wrap up, where can our listeners learn more about your work and the organization, your work personally? And if they want to reach out with any questions, what's the best way for them to do that?
Great. Well, I'm a massive fan of LinkedIn. I think LinkedIn has created a global platform and a global community for learning and sharing information. So I have tried to be active on LinkedIn. I've got 995,000 followers.
5,000 away from a million, right?
No, I'm really dying for the next 5,000.
Come on, guys, just go over there. 5,000 away from a million. It's what an achievement for you as well. It just goes. It's a testament to the work and that you're giving back, right? And all of the content you're putting out. And
Thank you.
Congratulations on that.
So the other two places, for if anyone is on the younger side or has kids or advising younger people on their careers, something I'm very proud of. You mentioned it, Chris, at the top, was the most recent book I wrote called The Career Playbook. And there's a website, thecareerplaybook.com, that has kind of all sorts of advice on interviewing and how to think about careers and all of that. And then our Spencer Stewart website has a rich treasure trove of resources, spencerstewart.com, on leadership, on governance, on career paths, and all of that. So that would be great. But I really appreciated the opportunity to chat, and I wish you continued success with your incredible company, and I'm looking forward to partnering with you as we go forward.
Fantastic. Well, as always, guys, if you head over to hrleaders.com, you'll find the show notes from the episode. Everything that Jim's been talking about, all the books, the resource, anything that was mentioned throughout the show will all be linked there. So to make life easier for you. Apart from that, thank you so much for taking the time out to join us. And I wish you all the best until we next speak. And we look forward to once you've written a new book and done all of the research with these individuals. I'm really excited to have you back on and talk about that with the guys.
Wonderful.